Trump this weekend posting a quote to social media often attributed to Napoleon. It reads, "He who saves his country does not violate any law." Perhaps more alarming than that interpretation of presidential power and its unlimited scope is that the Supreme Court, in its ruling on presidential immunity last summer, has already sort of agreed with Napoleon and Trump. In her dissent in that case, provided with what she called a fear for our democracy, Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote this, quote, "The relationship between the president and the people he served has shifted irrecoverably. In every use of presidential power, the president is now a king above the law."
Welcome to the Ken Harbaugh Show. I'm joined today by Liza Goitein, who serves as the Senior Director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program. She is one of the country's foremost experts on presidential emergency powers and government surveillance. Liza, I have to imagine, given the line of work that you're in, business is booming right now.
Unfortunately, yes. I'm very busy.
This audience has an understanding that many of the checks on presidential power are norms and traditions, and we've taken those for granted as a country for so long. But can you go into some of the specific levers that the executive has at their disposal that we never really worried about before because we depended on those norms and traditions? And now it turns out, even within the bounds of the Constitution, the president can do some pretty terrifying things.
Sure. So I will take your question sort of on its face, and I will start by talking about some of the laws and emergency powers that give the president authorities that I think are dangerous in the wrong hands. However, at some point, I want to come back to a slightly different question, which is these laws and powers, they do have limits built into them. Is he going to respect those limits? So basically, there are emergency powers in this country that Congress has granted to the president that give the president unusual flexibility in times of emergency, that basically allow him to do things that go beyond what would be allowed under ordinary non-emergency laws. And there are several different legal frameworks that apply during emergencies. The broadest one is the National Emergencies Act. Under the National Emergencies Act, the president can declare a national emergency, and that declaration unlocks powers that are included in about 150 different laws that Congress has passed all over throughout the decades. And those laws all say something like, in a national emergency, the president can do X. So President Trump has already declared 4 national emergencies, I think, unless I've lost count, and has invoked specific provisions under those national emergency declarations. There is a national emergency declaration at the southern border, basically the same one that he issued in 2019. He's invoking the same powers, a power that he thinks will allow him to secure funding to build the border wall, a power to call up reservists and National Guard forces to supplement the forces that are already at the southern border assisting the Department of Homeland Security. He's also declared national emergencies to impose sanctions on members of the International Criminal Court. And he's invoked emergency powers to impose tariffs on China, Canada, and Mexico, although he walked back the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. So we've already seen, and he invoked a national emergency relating to energy production, although it's not remotely clear how he's going to use emergency powers in that scenario at this point. So,
is there any domain in which the president can't just decide to invoke emergency powers?
Well,
what if he wants to rename Monday Trump Day? Right?
Could he? I mean, so the upside of this system, or maybe I should say the silver lining, is that even though Congress has granted the president very broad powers in a national emergency declaration, and that these powers span almost every imaginable area of governance, they are not infinite. And they are only the powers that Congress chose to grant. And let me give you the best possible example. There is no emergency power anywhere under the National Emergencies Act or anywhere else that allows the president to suspend the provisions of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Congress did not give the president that authority. And the president does not have emergency powers that Congress did not grant to the president, because unlike almost every other country's constitution, the Constitution of the United States does not give the president any explicit emergency powers. So with a few narrow exceptions, which we can discuss, the president must rely on Congress as the source of his emergency powers.
How much does that reassure you in this political climate? You know what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah.
We have a completely obsequious Congress right now and a Supreme Court that seems to be in the grip of, well, I'm not going to go too far because we have seen some really encouraging checks in that branch. But, you know, there's some alarming stuff.
Right. I mean, I think the question when it comes to the courts is, will the Trump administration obey the courts? Because we already saw some hints over the weekend with some tweets, most notably by J.D. Vance, suggesting that somehow the courts are not authorized to tell the president that his actions are unlawful in certain areas of law. And of course, it's been understood for well over 2 centuries that it is the province of the court to decide when the president's actions are lawful or unlawful. I mean, that is what the courts do. That is their job. I mean, not just the president, but other people as well.
We've seen this coming from J.D. Vance from a mile away, back to his infamous podcast appearance in which he advised President Trump to fire all the mid-level bureaucrats and then defy the Supreme Court if they dared challenge him. Right. So were you surprised to see him begin to, in the role of vice president, lay the groundwork for a potential defiance of the courts?
I will say I was surprised to see it happen this quickly. I was worried that at some point in the administration, we might see the Trump administration refuse to comply with court orders. I didn't think it would be teed up so quickly. Now, to be clear, there is not yet a court order that the administration has said we are not going to comply with this order. There are serious questions that have been raised about whether the administration is in compliance with a couple of the court orders that are currently in effect, especially when it comes to the unfreezing of funds. There are funds that are not flowing that should be flowing under the court's order. So I think there is a question of whether there is full compliance right now with judicial orders, but at least there has not been a stated intent or a stated claim that the president has the right to ignore the courts.
Do you think the administration is looking intentionally for that opportunity? We just had Mark Zaid on, who suggested that maybe they're hunting for just the right issue to test the tolerance of the country for this kind of defiance. And I wouldn't put it past them.
No, I mean, I think if you're going to try to subvert the constitutional structure, you kind of look for the right moment to do it. If you're being smart about it, now, that's a big question mark. But no, I mean, it's if you can't put it past them to try to subvert the constitutional order, then you can't put it past them to try to find the right moment to do so. I think, you know, the hope is that this is bluster, right? The hope is that the administration will find a face-saving way to continue to assert this unbounded executive power while in practice adhering to what the courts are ordering, in order to avoid teeing up a situation where there might actually be some kind of meaningful pushback, even from Congress.
Why would we imagine it's bluster? I mean, have we seen any evidence of that? Hope can't be our strategy here.
No, and it's not a strategy. It is. I think I literally put it as a hope. So no. I mean, I don't think there's any. I'm certainly not complacent or sanguine that this is just bluster. I think we need to be very seriously worried about it. And among other things, I think it's important to make sure that there is a broader and deeper understanding of the role that the separation of powers plays in our democracy, in our constitutional system, and what happens if the president becomes the person who decides what laws he will follow and when he will or will not be constrained by the courts, and what that looks like for a democracy. And I think that very quickly becomes a country not only that has lost its freedom and that isn't truly a democracy, but a country that cannot function and that cannot sustain the kind of activities. I think the sort of robust economic and cultural and social life of this country depends on freedoms and institutions that are protected by the separation of powers. And so it becomes a very long and dark path that we are treading if that goes away.
Hey everyone, it's Ken. I've got another amazing writing retreat to share with you. The last one in Archeron, France is full, but another has opened up and it sounds just as incredible. It's in the Italian countryside, not far from Rome, and it's hosted by two award-winning writing coaches, Athena Dixon and Anne-Marie Kelly. Just imagine writing in a place like this. Telling stories is what makes us human, and we all have those stories in our pockets about love and loss, joy and grief. Let Anne-Marie and Athena help you lay your stories on the page. You'll gather each morning in an historic Italian village to focus on craft and storytelling. And afternoons will be spent with local artisans passionate about sharing their culture and traditions. This once-in-a-lifetime retreat is for women of all ages and experiences who long to build community, search for answers, and dismantle the roadblocks that stand in your way. Athena and Anne-Marie practice writing as a form of healing, and don't we all need that right now? If you want to write beautiful prose in a beautiful place, join Athena and Anne-Marie at Strada Toscana. No more excuses. This world-class coaching team will help you put your stories on paper in an amazing setting. Join them in Italy this fall. Click the link in the show notes to learn more. Thanks. Are you surprised at all at how fragile it all seems? I mean, institutions that have taken decades and generations to build up. I come at this as someone with a national security background. The cultivation and expansion of American soft power, which has taken generations, is being dismantled in a matter of weeks. There was that brilliant Atlantic article about Hitler dismantling democracy in 53 days. I am surprised, even as alarmist as I was in the run-up to the election, at just how quickly these guardrails are being obliterated and the institutions being attacked and in one or two cases dismantled.
Right. Well, it's not over. So I think, if in fact this administration succeeds in dismantling the federal government, then yes, I will be surprised at the fragility and how quickly it went away. We're not there yet. So I'm not quite willing to say, wow, it was all nothing. This was just a facade of stability and endurance. I don't think we're quite there yet. But the other thing I would say is that, to the extent what we are seeing is an attempt to supplant a democracy with, let's say, an oligarchy, I don't think that does happen in 53 days. I think the seeds of that would have to have been in place for a long time. And I think a lot of what needs to happen, in addition to defending the institutions that are being attacked, is to do some deep thinking about what led us to be in a place where those institutions could be attacked and how we need to build back differently if and when we get past this episode in our history.
It sounds to me like you're suggesting that we don't have a lot of time to fix this, that it actually started a long time ago, and we may be at the tail end of this assault on democracy.
Yeah, I mean, it has certainly taken a very dramatic turn. I don't want to downplay that. It's more just that the seeds for this have been present in various different ways. During the first Trump administration, a lot of people said, that Trump was both a cause and a symptom of some of the dysfunctions that we were seeing. And I just think it's important not to forget that. And I'm a little worried that after the first Trump administration, when President Biden was elected, there was too much of a sort of collective wiping of our brows and saying, okay, we survived, business as usual. And, there were a lot of legal reforms that organizations like the Brennan Center had been advocating for during the Trump administration that our allies on the Hill were very dedicated to. And then once Trump appeared to be in the rearview mirror, there was less of a sense of urgency around those reforms on the Hill. And, at the Brennan Center, we retained that sense of urgency. We said, now is the time to do this. But I think there was a sense of, okay, this was a blip. We're past it. We can move on. And we don't really have to necessarily, at least hurry, to make some of these structural changes, some of these legal changes at a more systemic level to make sure that the checks and balances and guardrails are in place. That's the easiest example of what we cannot do this time around. If and when we survive this assault on the rule of law, we have to shore up the rule of law in many ways.
What are some of the levers at the president's disposal that he hasn't yet exercised? Are there even more dangerous tools in the toolkit that we need to anticipate?
He has talked about invoking the Insurrection Act. It's something he's talked about a lot. He's first started talking about it in 2020, and he basically hasn't stopped. The Insurrection Act is a law that gives the president very broad power to deploy federal armed forces domestically to quell civil unrest or to enforce the law. It's meant to be used in crisis situations, but unfortunately, the language of it is broad enough to give the president quite a bit of discretion. And Trump has threatened to use it to quell protests, to intervene in cities that he says are crime dens, to involve federal armed forces in immigration enforcement, presumably in a more active role than right now, where they are supporting the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security at the southern border. So he has threatened to use it in a number of ways. And in his, I think it was in his emergency proclamation at the southern border, he directed the secretaries of Homeland Security and Defense to submit a joint report within 90 days, which I guess is now 67 days. I don't check my math on that. That would include a recommendation whether or not to invoke the Insurrection Act. How that would differ from what's happening right now, because the military is involved right now in border security and has been for decades. What this would do is allow federal armed forces to directly participate in immigration enforcement, including apprehension and detention of migrants, and not just at the border, but also in the interior of the country. So I think that is a live threat. Another thing that he has said he might do, and that he seems to be preparing to do, is to invoke the Alien Enemies Act. That is the last remaining vestige of the notorious Alien and Sedition Acts from back in 1798. It only applies during a declared war or when the president proclaims an invasion by a foreign government or nation. But if those conditions are met, then the president can summarily detain and deport any non-citizen, non-U.S. citizen over the age of 14 who is a citizen of or was born in the enemy nation. And basically what that does is two things. It allows the president, first of all, to just get around all of the procedural protections of immigration law, the hearings, the lawyers, et cetera, just dispense with those. And it also allows the president to deport people who are lawfully in this country if they were born in the enemy nation.
Who determines when those conditions are met?
Well, in the first instance, the president. And then, so the president here would have to say there's an invasion by a foreign government or nation. There's been reports that he is going to say that, is it Tren de Aragua, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, is a wing of the Venezuelan government. And, because there's no due process involved, because this is just summary deportation, the president can say someone's a member of the gang. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, right? So that is the risk involved in this authority. Traditionally, courts have been very reluctant to, question, a president's determination that there's an invasion, or to question a president's determination that an entity is acting as a foreign government. It's clear if you look through the case law, what the Supreme Court has said, there's always this sort of hint of a backstop. There's this hint that, a president could go so far and could just act in such bad faith that this no longer becomes, that he has exceeded the permissible bounds of honest judgment, I think is the way it's been described. So there's certainly a chance that the Supreme Court would say, sorry, this is a wartime authority and we're not being invaded by a hostile foreign power, if he invokes the Alien Enemies Act.
Let's play out the nightmare scenario, whether it's the Alien and Enemies Act or the Insurrection Act. The Supreme Court does its constitutional duty and it checks the president. What happens when J.D. Vance gets in the president's ear and says, they don't have an army, you do? How is that? How does that play out?
Well, I mean, that's the constitutional crisis that we're all hoping to avoid. I mean, that's not game over, right? I mean, Congress, that would be grounds for impeachment, right there, right? At some point, members of Congress have to decide whether they're better off living in a democracy with the rule of law or without. And, right now, they might not be feeling the sting or seeing the personal risk to themselves. At some point that will crystallize. At some point, the public will become, and their constituents will become very unhappy. They may be more unhappy with the effects of tariffs on the economy or the effect of freezing federal funds to their state and local agencies. That may be, what triggers the unhappiness. But at some point, members of Congress may very well decide, conservative members of Congress who are right now in lockstep with Trump may decide that that's not where their bread is buttered anymore. So
you talked about personal risks to members of Congress. Up until now, at least, those conservative members have felt that personal risk in the form of threats from MAGA. And we know from some pretty good reporting that in the case of impeachment, in the case of other really important votes, they have voted based on fear of that, not from fear of descending into tyranny.
Right, but don't forget, if the federal government is dismantled and if we have these sky-high tariffs, life is not going to be good for the MAGA crowd or for anyone else. People who associate themselves as MAGA, they need healthcare, they need schools, they need roads, they need the services that their state and local governments provide with the assistance of the federal government. And so, I am counting them as some of the people who may be disillusioned more quickly than you would think if things start to really go south in the way, if you follow the trajectory that we're on right now, in the way that we're heading.
Well, we're beginning to see glimpses of that with the farmers, for example, realizing with the shuttering of USAID, there's no one to buy their harvest. I think the what's it called? The FAFO effect is settling in pretty hard in some of these communities. It's incumbent upon communicators and the Democratic Party to make sure the onus of blame lies where it deserves to lie.
Right. And I don't think it will be difficult to connect the dots if we see the kind of dramatic dislocations inside the United States that these policies are going to cause. These are the kinds of hardships that are routinely blamed on the president, even when it's not the president's fault. So, even when COVID created economic difficulties inside the United States, President Biden was blamed for it, right? So presidents tend to catch the blame for these sorts of things, whether earned or not earned. In this case, we're talking about that is where the blame should lie and probably will lie.
I hope you're right. It's amazing to me that the price of eggs has gone up and it's everyone's fault but the president's. So there is a Teflon effect. I hope it wears off. Liza, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great having you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.